Let's go to Syntex. Boy, we've got some of the real big winners. This was probably my first big stock, was this one, and it came at a time, I think I bought Chrysler back in 63 and sold it. And this had run up. I didn't get in on the first little double bottom that showed, but it took off and ran and built a high tight flag. I was working for Hayden Stone. We were in a big room, and there must have been 15 other brokers there. One of them came over to me and said, "Hey, did you see this stock?" And he bought the stock, but he sold it about a week later, and I think he took 5 points out of it or 10 points or something like that. So he didn't know what he had. I looked at it, and I saw right away that it was this, high tide flag, and it was acting right and all. I had models at that time of 3 or 4 other high tide flags the year before or 2 or 3 years before that. And I looked at that and I said, gee, there's one here. On top of that, I think the earnings were up 200% in the last couple of quarters, which is an enormous amount. I bought the stock coming right out of that. I think that was around $80 or $100 a share, not 16. It had a little bit of a basing area and took off and really ran. And by that time, I'm up 45 or 55% or so. And now I've got a much bigger cushion, and I can afford to give it more room and more leniency. There was a period where it had one day, and that was in October of 63. In one day, it dropped 25 points, and I think it was selling over 100 at that time. And they may have stopped trading in it, and it had one trade at the end of the day down 25 points. I didn't sell in that because I had this huge gain. This is probably a good time to mention this. I think that it's much easier if you have a few rules so that you say, okay, I got into this now and I'm ahead so much, and now I'm going to hold it until either this happens or this happens or this happens. That might be, I'll either have a climax top or it closes a week below the 10-week moving average line on enormous volume. In other words, you operate by rules at each stage of the game, and that's a lot easier than, oh, I love this stock and it's a good company, and you always feel that way about it. The market changing all the time, and all of a sudden the time will come when it is changing and you got to see it and you got to act, and you need the rules that will help you see those things, not how you feel. Because I think if you go by how you feel, you're just going to make a lot of mistakes. If you have no rules at all, you're just going by your brilliant wisdom and judgment. You're taking some pretty big risks that you don't need to take, I don't think. But I think a lot of people operate that way. And also, egos can get into it. You're trying to prove that you're right. Well, I don't ever want to prove I'm right. The market's the one that's right, and I got to watch what it's doing very carefully. At some point, I think I had such a huge gain, and I had half or more of a 6-month capital gain, and I decided, okay, I'm going to hold it until I get the capital gain because I was way ahead. And I think that's the only time I've ever done that, too. I normally had never had that as an objective on stocks. In other words, I didn't care whether it was short-term gains or long-term gains, and I didn't want to be frozen into, I've got to wait and try to get my long-term capital gains. In those days, I would have been willing to sell something 3 weeks before the long-term gain. If I thought, gee, it's not acting right, get rid of it. But in this situation, pretty far down the line, that was the last little rule that we went by. So at that point, I'm now waiting to get my 6 months, and when I got my 6 months in one day, out I went. So I don't care where an idea comes from. Some of them you'll get on your own, some of them get somewhere else. But you need to have a system and a method of what you're looking for. In other words, if I'd looked at that and the earnings weren't there or the sales weren't there, I wouldn't have bought it. Or if the chart wasn't right, I wouldn't have bought it. But I looked at it and everything was there, and the earnings were big at the time, and that's where I started. And once I had it, I held it according to certain rules, and that was probably my biggest winner that I've had because it had this enormous move, and it was only in about 6 or 8 months. You can look at the chart here and see it broke out of that in July of 63. And by the end of 63, the stock had gone up 5 times. We held it through most of that situation and sold it about a week or two after the top.